So welcome to the first panel discussion today, Power, Institutional Foundations for Classes and States. So before I pass the microphone off to my colleagues, just briefly, I first met Leo, actually it was my very first class as an undergraduate student in political science. My very first day. I'm one of those who left York and then came back. And the very first comment that Leo made in this first year political science class was a question, in fact. Can a socialist professor live in a bourgeois home? And I had no idea, quite frankly, what he was talking about. And my first thought was to quickly revisit my decision to major in political science and perhaps become an anthropologist or something. And so it was, I could have never predicted that about 10 years later I would be doing my dissertation under Leo, studying the role of institutions, namely the Federal Reserve, in the evolution of post-war capitalism and its many contradictions, and the management of its many contradictions. But really is kind of precisely this focus on state institutions and state markets and corporations and institutions, is focused on institutions and their autonomy, their specificity, their capacity, their contingency, that captured my imagination and that brought me back to York after 10 years to study with Leo and to do my dissertation with him. Against so many other Marxists who want to subsume institutions to the totalizing logic of capital and to wash them away with these broad assertions that institutions are simply just the reflection or the crystallization of existing power relations, Leo forced consideration of the complexities which actually drive real existing capitalism. And forced his students to consider these things, and this was very appealing to me. Someone who had come from Wall Street from a career in banking, a very short one, albeit, and who had seen the remarkable way in which bond markets operate and their importance, and the decisions that people make and their importance. So Leo's focus on institutions was incredibly captivating, incredibly stimulating, and mapped very well with my understanding of the world. And I think to a certain extent, at least, the presentation today, the panel discussion today, will highlight this particular way of approaching Marxism and viewing and grappling with the concept of relative autonomy in this particular way. So I'll leave my comments there and thank Leo for all of the tremendous work he's done, because really my academic career was bookended, at least in the classroom, with Leo on my very first day, and then Leo again by my side as I received my doctorate on my very last day at York. And so his contribution has been very strong and very lasting, and I appreciate everything. But with that, I'll pass the discussion. We'll just go in order. We'll hear from Ruth first, and then Adam Hilton and Ursula, and then finish off with Doug. And I think the conversation will reflect the dynamism and the very specific and special nature of Leo's contribution to Marxism and to all of us.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm going to start by repeating what other people said before. I don't have enough words to describe my intellectual debt to Leo, and as many others already said, his generosity and support when I needed it without even having to ask for it. And also his interest in what I had to say in my very broken English when I arrived in Canada to start my MA, thinking that I knew more than what I actually did, but without having any idea that the decision to come here would change my life. Before coming here, I had some familiarity with Marxist theory of the state, and I was torn between empirical mainstream analysis of institutional capacities of the state, which I was doing for a living, and the theoretical formulations about the capitalist state. So I had to thank Leo, among other many things, for helping me to convey this possibility of bringing together a non-dogmatic theoretical perspective about the state and a systematic historical analysis of state institutions and policies, which I had not found in my previous rudimentary Marxist theory of the state. Also, his reading of way too many versions of my dissertation, sorry about that, Leo, was also an incredible learning experience for me, and I had to confess that I missed my time reading my dissertation for that. A marginal note would be the key to reorganize the entire argument and solve the kind of problems with which I was struggling for months. And even though I know that Leo is enjoying his very active retirement, I have to say I'm sorry for future generations of students that won't have this opportunity. So when I was thinking about my presentation, I also recalled that I made the decision to leave Argentina to come back to school with the single purpose of making sense of why was such, it was year 2000, late 90s, early 2000s, why was such a widespread consensus around neoliberal austerity in my country. At York, I moved in a somehow different direction, and more importantly, Argentina and Latin America also moved away from neoliberal austerity for a while, but after 17 years, I'm again trying to understand how is that a quite terrifying right turn is spreading throughout the region without much resistance. This has been keeping me awake at night pretty often. So asking this question is pretty much asking about what happened to the pink tide. Sorry. And I think that it is important to understand this, not only because some melancholic feeling about what could have happened but did not, but because we need to find the keys or what is going on in Latin America in the experiences of the pink tide. And also maybe, and only maybe, the Latin American experiences are useful for those who are now working to build left political forces with expectations to come to political power, which was much of the discussion yesterday. In many cases, analysis about the pink tide have been policy checklists rather than theoretically informed, rigorous historical investigation. There have been general statements about anti-imperialism, radical or not so radical change that have worked for a while until the moment of disillusion came. But I think this is not very helpful to understand trajectories from economic and political miracle to what seems to be an irreversible decline. And in close relation to this, I want to start with Leo's insistence on studying the central role of the state and state institutions in processes of change, being them neoliberal reforms or what came after the crisis of neoliberal reforms in this case. And instead of engaging in endless debates about whether policies were really taking distance from neoliberalism or capitalism, or were just cosmetic, I think that the more interesting question is the question about the nature of the state in the pink tide, the institutional architecture of the state, its complex relations to the momentous changes in the balances of forces that occurred in the context of the crisis of neoliberalism in the region, how state policies have been linked to capital accumulation and class balances, what has changed and what has remained the same in terms of the institutional selectivity of the state via the class relations and class struggles. And I want to identify a few issues that may be useful for a serious examination of the pink tide. First, the new forms of internationalization of the state and the creation of conditions for the transnationalization of local bourgeoisies that came along with the so-called new developmentalist state, a state that took pain to recreate conditions for growth based on aggressive expansion of natural resource extraction and processing, mostly for export. In the context of the pink tide, the internationalization of the state was not materializing through liberalization and deregulation, which had been the case before in the period of neoliberal reforms, but through forms of regional cooperation to build infrastructure for interconnection, power plants, dams, pipelines, corridors, ports, etc., that would improve the circulation of commodities and consolidate the role of the region as commodity exporter, and also foster the transnationalization of local bourgeoisies. This stage of internationalization was not, of course, was not without conflict, as governments advanced it with nationalist and anti-imperialist languages, with arguments about Latin American unity and autonomous development. Also, fractions of domestic bourgeoisies adopted nationalist positions, and there were, equally important, there were widespread struggles around disputes for alternative uses of land, population displacement, environmental effects of these infrastructure projects. A second dimension is the relationship between the state and working classes. In the 2000s, in Latin America was a period of reversal of some of the appalling social indicators of the previous decade, including meaningful reductions in poverty and extreme poverty, but with also the persistence of highly fragmented labor markets and widespread labor precariousness. Despite government's efforts to enforce labor market regulations in many cases, this is probably a particularity of the recent Latin American experience. I mean, governments were not pushing for more labor market flexibilization, but were trying to enforce some labor market regulations. A couple of things about this. One is that the export-oriented nature of the forms of internationalization of the Latin American economies are surely not the only cause, but one of the causes of the contemporary forms of labor market fragmentation, as workers' consumption and the purchasing power of domestic wages are now less central to the accumulation strategies of leading fractions of local bourgeoisies compared to the role these things played in the import substitution industrialization of the post-war period. Expectedly, the class alliances and forms of class conciliation back in the pink tide experiences were more fragile and volatile than those that had characterized the Latin American import substitution industrialization. And this is the case despite the radical rhetoric of pink tide governments. Yet, important improvements in the situation of workers, including that of precarious workers, did happen, but the economic slowdown of the late 2000s and early 2010s and its effects on workers' income and access to state provisions resulted in increasing political tensions between governments and organized labor. An example of this is the ambitious program of guaranteed basic income implemented in several countries of the region that effectively helped to assist most precarious workers and reduce poverty, and especially extreme poverty. And these programs were seen as highly successful and initially helped to strengthen support to governments, but when growth slowed down and distributive clashes intensified, social spending became an object of heated controversy and impugnation by broad social groups, including many sectors of the working classes. And a different aspect of the transformation of the relationship between state and workers was the massive expansion of consumption and the forms of integration through markets. Ironically, it was in the context of the pink tide rather than the context of neoliberal reforms that workers became active participants in markets and consumers, and in many cases also as micro-entrepreneurs and self-employed, supported by social assistance policies. And I think that the expansion of consumption and entrepreneurship and the policies that stimulated all this raised important political questions. First, there is a tension between encouraging consumption and market integration that reaped immediate political and electoral gains, and allocating resources for other purposes, mostly infrastructure and services. I mean, workers at some point were able to increase their purchasing power and acquire durable goods, but in many cases their quality of life did not improve accordingly, as public utility networks are deteriorated, so are roads, public transportations, hospitals, education, etc. Okay. Consumption and entrepreneurship raise also questions about the intensification of market subjectivities and their political consequences. To what extent policies that encourage this, the intensification of inclusion, the inclusion, through markets, prepare the terrain for the ongoing right turn in the region? And also, I wonder if left governments can offer a vision of future that, without neglecting the absolute importance of guaranteeing access to goods that have to do with basic levels of comfort and dignity, can go beyond access to markets. I mean, there is a big question about what accounts for a meaningful change in the quality of life of workers. And to finish, I want to go back to the old discussion about the retreat of the state or the return of the state. I mean, clearly the neoliberal restructuring was not a retreat of the state anywhere, and not in Latin America for sure, but the idea of retreat helped to blur the political nature of policy decisions and justify austerity policies in technocratic terms. Conversely, the ideas of the return of the state that accompanied the pink tide brought the political nature of policies back to the fore, but it also fostered the illusion that the state itself can go beyond the contradictions of capital accumulation, or that problems with capital accumulation emerge because of the retreat of the state. So the frustration with the predictable failure to solve these contradictions in the absence of meaningful structural change becomes a direct responsibility of the state. What states actually did was to transform the social agency of the struggles against neoliberalism in Latin America, struggles that played a central role in bringing the pink tide governments to power into policies. And if we are not naive about the role of the state, we should acknowledge that this institutionalization is a transformation of agency into something else. Beyond the good or bad intentions of progressive governments and bureaucrats, the transformation of politics into policies is problematic. We don't know what to do with. So another unanswered question is how to open spaces for the democratization of the state and policies without creating mechanisms for purely formal participation for the capture and fragmented control of the state with pockets of corruption, which is what happened in Latin America in the last decade. So going to stop here. Yeah, this may be pretty disorganized line of thought, but through which I'm trying to make sense of the decline of the pink tide, and as I said, a note of caution also about the difficulties facing left organizations trying to get into electoral politics and government. Thank you.
Thank you very much.